Dr. Clint Andrews. He's going to do a short introduction, and then we'll jump into it.
Okay, thanks, Laura. And so this is an exciting moment. This is Laura's dissertation defense. And she's going to give a presentation, and then following that, there'll be a question and answer period where we ask all of you to join in and ask questions and make arguments. And then we will, after that, conclude the open portion of the defense, and the committee members will stay on to continuing to ask questions and make suggestions and make comments. And then after that, the committee will have a vote, and then we'll have a wrap up after that. So that's the plan. And Laura, why don't we get started?
All right. Thank you so much, Clint. Appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Again, thanks to everybody for being here. Feel free to pile comments into the chat. In the meantime, I welcome feedback and comments, and my materials are under review, so happy to take as many comments and questions as you can come up with. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Laura Geronimo. I'm very excited to be presenting my dissertation today. It's been a lot of work. I just want to jump into some acknowledgements. It's an amazing day to be presenting. It is International Women's Day, so I realize that I stand on the shoulders of giants, even being able to have the opportunity to stand up here and present. I want to thank all of my family and friends for supporting me through this process. I'd like to thank, gracias a todos que están participando desde Puerto Rico, aunque mi tesis no se trata de Puerto Rico en particular. Muchos de los temas son basados en cosas que han pasado en Puerto Rico y estoy muy agradecida por todos los que me acompañan desde allá. I'd also love to acknowledge my dissertation committee, Drs. Clint Andrews, Drs. Bob Cobb, Dr. Will Payne, and Dr. Elizabeth Gilmore, who have provided me guidance throughout this process. And without their guidance, I would still be swimming around in an ocean of ideas looking for a spot to land. The title of my presentation is Prioritizing Federal Investments for Coastal Adaptation. This is funded by the New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium. Without that funding, I would not be able to complete this project. And before we jump in, I want to draw your attention to this picture on the slide, which is a picture I took in my case study region of Toms River, New Jersey, a coastal community. And for me, it really represents the paradox of what seems to have become the American dream, extending beyond just home ownership, which is already difficult to access for many Americans, to also owning a secondary home in the coastal zone. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that vision and that dream. But for me, the question is, at what cost, at what risk to yourself and your family, and at what cost to society at large? So you'll see this big home propped up on pylons, and this is a recurring theme throughout my presentation. So keep that in mind as we go through. Yeah. All right. So we're going to go over some conceptual backgrounds. Then we're going to jump into national trends. Then we're going to look at a case study in Toms River, New Jersey. And we're going to do some conclusions and Q&A. The presentation is about 50 slides. Normally, I do one chunk for one presentation. There's a lot of material to get through here, so bear with me. And I encourage you again to put questions in the chat in case I can't get to everybody's questions. I hope to have at least one or two questions in the chat when I get done. So my research interest lies at the intersection of planning and public policy, coastal climate risk and resilience, and land use planning. And my drive for my research really comes from observation of the world around me and changes going on physically around the coast. So the motivating question is, how can federal investments be prioritized for coastal adaptation to produce outcomes that are equitable, efficient, and effective? And we'll break this statement down as we go through the presentation. So some background: we are living in an era of rapidly changing climate. Sea levels are expected to rise relative to 1900. By the end of the century, we expect sea levels to rise by between 1.6 and 3.3 feet globally. Though there may be instances where the rise is even higher. Sea level rise exacerbates flood events. We're seeing higher counts of flood events, more and more damages associated with severe storms. So as that ocean rises, storm surge impacts become more intense. So this is a graphic borrowed from NOAA, where we see US billion-dollar disaster events over the past 40 years, and we're seeing a drastic increase. And a big question that this raises is, to what extent is this a result of increasing hazards and flood events? And to what extent is it a result of human decisions to occupy and develop in the floodplain? And given that we live in an era of scarce resources, how do we distribute resources to mitigate or reduce that risk? There's a lot of different types of physical response to flood risk. I studied two types of property level adaptation actions that are commonly funded by the US federal government in the United States. One is called a property elevation, and that's like that image that you saw on the first screen, where you vertically escape the floodplain by lifting up buildings on pylons or stilts, and that allows water to accommodate underneath the building. The second is a property buyout, which is where you use a combination of federal, state, and local funds, purchase the property usually at fair market value, and physically relocate people and assets out of the floodplain. So fundamentally, these two property actions represent two distinct adaptation pathways to either stay in the floodplain or leave the floodplain. And I'm interested in the trade-offs associated with those actions. And for example, what might be the spillover effects associated with staying in the floodplain? And also, what might be the benefits of leaving the floodplain, like investing in ecosystem-based adaptation? So for example, one spillover effect of staying is that eventually you may need to invest in more protective infrastructure. All right, so there's a lot of different disaster recovery programs that operate in the post-disaster space or in and around the disaster space. I study a large range of federal programs, mostly FEMA programs, including National Flood Insurance, Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, and other programs, including US Army Corps of Engineers and Department of Transportation programs. And as we implement these programs, it's important to recognize that they're being implemented over a landscape that's already been shaped by land use, housing, and finance policies that have historically benefited certain populations over others, typically white and wealthier populations. So as we implement the programs, how do we make sure that we're not exacerbating patterns of spatial segregation and wealth inequality? Also, we need to recognize that we're operating in a rapidly changing climate. So how do we make sure that the revenues are invested wisely? This is all very important and relevant in the current political context, because there's been major bills passed recently with trillions of dollars flowing from the federal government to local governments for infrastructure jobs. So I've tracked about over $1 trillion of these dollars, and about $50 billion are going towards climate resilience projects and $5 billion towards coastal resilience projects. However, in my view, anything that happens in the coast should be viewed through the lens of coastal resilience, because it will affect your asset life cycle. Okay, so how do we evaluate flood risk programs and policies? The dominant paradigm over the past century has been this economic efficiency policy or evaluation criteria, where you take the aggregate benefits of a project to society, compare them to the aggregate costs, and you choose the project where the benefits outweigh the cost. But this is increasingly becoming scrutinized by the concept of social equity, which says we don't really know how those costs and benefits are distributed. So who gets the benefits, who gets the cost? And that's the distributional equity argument. And from a procedural justice perspective, who actually decides what is a benefit and what is a cost, and who makes those decisions? Another criteria is effectiveness. So how well will these strategies actually hold up to future flood risk? In addition to this evaluation criteria, I just want to keep some key theoretical concepts in your minds. The first is response risk, or when actions may have unintended negative consequences. So if a community builds a seawall and then it ends up creating flooding in a neighboring community, that's an example of a spillover effect, a negative consequence. And this rolls into the concept of fiscal federalism, which asks what levels of government should be making decisions? Should it be more centralized or decentralized? And this harks back to the ratification of the Constitution and is an age-old debate that is very relevant in today's political context. It's also relevant because climate impacts are having diffuse spillover effects. So how do we manage that from a governance perspective? This rolls into the concept of the political economy of climate adaptation, which recognizes that there are real interests at stake and there's a struggle over power and resources. So how do we make decisions about, who has the power to make these decisions about where resources are invested? All right, so coming back to my overarching research question, that was all my background. We're going to jump into my national study, followed by my case study. So jumping into the national study, the driving research question is, what factors control for the distribution of federally funded investments in home elevations and buyouts? And is there evidence of systemic bias? So I do this through a case study of FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is the largest and oldest hazard mitigation assistance program. It's funded over 100,000 property actions. And it was established by the Stafford Act in 1988. A lot of the actions at the property level have been wind-related retrofits, but I focus on a subset of property acquisitions or buyouts and elevations in response to flood-related events. So a lot of the literature has focused on buyouts. So contribution is comparing where buyouts and elevations are occurring. So this is a map of my dependent variable, basically, for my first chapter, which is the ratio of elevations to buyouts. And in this map, they're aggregated over the 30-year period and aggregated at the county level. But what's interesting is that in yellow are areas where we're seeing all buyouts, and in red is where we're seeing areas that are all elevations, where the dominant policy response is elevations. And we see clustering in the Mid-Atlantic, the Gulf, and the North Pacific. So there's really a dichotomous dominant policy response at the local level, which makes it a really interesting binary dependent variable problem appropriate for logistic regression analysis. So the way I set up the problem is that areas that are implementing buyouts are assigned to 0, and areas implementing elevations are assigned to 1. There are some areas that have a mix, but that is the general layout of the problem. This is my dependent variable formula. And when I actually study this, I study this at the zip code, which is the finest unit of geography available, and by disaster number. All right. So just a little bit of descriptive statistics. A lot of these events are buyouts and elevations are being driven by unnamed severe storms. The Great Midwest Flood of 1993 drove a lot of buyouts, which is why we see so much yellow in the center of the country. The Hurricane Sandy was the event that drove the most elevations, making it an interesting case study. So I reviewed the literature to come up with several hypotheses for what might explain a distribution of buyouts and elevations. And the economic efficiency hypothesis says that as median home value increases, it actually becomes very expensive to buy out homes. Basically, it's more expensive to buy out $1 million home than to buy out a $250,000 home. So we may expect more home elevations in areas with higher median home value from an efficiency perspective. The racial bias hypothesis states that traditionally, white communities have benefited from investments in home improvements. So maybe we can expect some racial bias based on prior literature. The political bias hypothesis states that more conservative-leaning political groups tend to have less concern for climate change and a stronger interest in preserving the local tax base. So perhaps we may expect to see more elevations in Republican-leaning areas. The coastal amenity hypothesis states that there's a real amenity value to living near the ocean or being able to visit the ocean. So maybe we would expect to see people wanting to rebuild near the coast. And the regulatory incentive hypothesis says that there are real benefits or economic incentives associated with being in special flood hazard areas, such as lowering your insurance premium costs if you elevate your building. So perhaps we expect to see more elevations in those areas. And a contribution of my work was to develop this novel data set, clean this very messy administrative FEMA database, and add in all of these variables to make this regression analysis possible. I did some background checks to make sure that the coefficients would not be biased. And this is my full equation here, where we see the different hypotheses, and I have some control variables as well as state and near fixed effects. And these are my results, where I'm plotting the coefficients in their 95% intervals, confidence intervals. And the way to read this graph is that if you have a coefficient of 1, these are odds ratios. So 1 means you have even odds. So taking fraction white, for example, at the national study where the sample is over 4,000 zip codes, it's basically even odds whether or not your zip code has a higher fraction white or lower fraction white. So we're not seeing this as we're not seeing support for this hypothesis at the national level. We are seeing strong support, on the other hand, for the coastal amenity hypothesis. If you're in a shoreline zip code, you're more than 5 times as likely to receive elevations as response to coastal flooding. So there's, again, not much support for the political bias hypothesis, but some support for the regulatory incentive hypothesis and the economic efficiency hypothesis. This is another way of looking at the data where I break the independent variable down by deciles. And basically, if you're in the top 10% of zip codes in terms of median home value, then you're more likely to have your home elevated than if you're in other deciles. Again, not seeing strong support for the racial and political bias hypothesis at the national level, but support for the regulatory incentive hypothesis. And we're seeing a strong effect of that coastal amenity hypothesis. So we actually split the data into this subset of the coastal zone, and we rerun the regression analysis. And what's interesting is that some signals start to come through on the racial and political hypotheses and indicate that maybe more research is warranted. So I did do some k-fold cross-validation for this model. We can come back to this in the Q&A if people want to know how it works. It's basically an indication of model performance. The model is operating with 91% accuracy, and it has substantial classification strength. So the contribution of this chapter is that it's the first national study comparing the distribution of buyouts and elevations. It identifies factors driving elevations over buyouts. We find that elevations are overrepresented in the coastal zone, and it identifies areas of the coast that may be really interesting for further case studies. And now this wraps into my second part, which is the case study of Ortley Beach and Toms River. I'm gonna have to go through some background a little bit quickly here, but coming right out of the case study, we see that Toms River stands out as an area where there's been a lot of elevations. And Toms River has also benefited from a lot of different federal funds. Here, what we're doing is we're backing out of just the FEMA hazard mitigation slice, which we can see is just a very small slice of the puzzle. And we're looking at a slew of federal programs that are intervening in the space of post-disaster recovery. So Ocean County, where Toms River resides, is receiving a larger share of this pie. And if we focus on this HUD money from Housing and Urban Development, and we break it down by municipality, we see that Toms River, my case study, is at the top of the list in terms of the amount of funding received by a municipality in the wake of Hurricane Sandy in 2012. So interestingly enough, too, this is Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds. We're seeing a lot of money coming through this reconstruction, rehabilitation, elevation, and mitigation program. So this chunk of funding is for elevations, basically. And a lot of it is accruing to people in the unmet needs category, meaning you don't have to comply with the low and moderate income category. So it just raises equity questions around who's benefiting from these disaster flows. So lots of really interesting things to dig into here. So I went to the town staff and I asked, I'm interested in your municipality and this phenomenon of building back after in areas that have experienced repetitive flood losses. And the planner oriented me towards the community of Ortley Beach, which is a barrier island community that was severely damaged during Hurricane Sandy when storm surge breached the dune system and destroyed many homes. Over 200 homes were destroyed, actually wiped out their foundation because the sand and water came through. And more than 1,000 homes were substantially damaged. And this is a community of about 2,000 homes. So what's happened 10 years later? Well, we have these tremendous development pressures. I only could locate one buyout site in the community right where that surge came through. And right next door, we have new condos going up on stilts right behind the engineered dune system that is struggling to establish itself and suffering from severe and constant erosion. So it really raises Ortley Beach is a fascinating case study to study the dual pressures of erosion and hazards from the coastal area and development pressures from the human decision-making side. So some sociodemographics on Ortley Beach. In blue here, we see Ortley Beach. It's majority white. New Jersey, compared to New Jersey average. Ortley Beach has a large elderly population. It has a higher than average median home value. However, the median household income tends to be below the New Jersey average or around the same as the New Jersey median. And there's a small number of renters, about 50% are owner occupied, and a large majority of the housing stock is seasonal. So this community really explodes in the summertime when people come through for that seasonal, when they come to enjoy the beach in the summertime. So a takeaway here is that there may be some fixed income retiree households that are income constrained and really struggling to make ends meet when there's costs associated with flooding. All right, so for this case study, I did two separate studies. One was interviews. So I did in-depth interviews. And the question was, what values, beliefs, and worldviews shape diverse stakeholder preferences toward federally funded risk reduction strategies? And borrowing from the literature, I created a framework to study how values, beliefs, and worldviews inform preferences for coastal risk reduction strategies, where values are what matters to people, beliefs are how people think things work in the world, and I focus on beliefs about climate science, and worldviews are whether or not you're kind of an individualistic person or more of a community-oriented person. So I interviewed 32 stakeholders from the federal, state, and municipal level, as well as residents, and about 21 stakeholders participated in a questionnaire. From the questionnaire results, we see that people prefer largely nature-based solutions. They don't like the idea of building land out and creating like new islands or new lands, like you might see in the United Arab Emirates or the Netherlands. But there's a lot of mixed sentiments around these other types of actions. So I'm curious what's driving that mixed sentiments. And so here I created a spectrum where I have preferences for actions to leave the island on this side and actions to stay on the island on this side. This is my x-axis. And on the y-axis, beliefs on climate science, with strong beliefs in the consensus on climate science in the top here and weak belief on the bottom. And I mapped out this plot by different types of stakeholders. And we see in blue here are residents, and they tend to cluster in this quadrant 1 and 2, where they have strong beliefs in climate science, but they're torn about what to do. Do we stay or do we leave? Conversely, local engineers and leadership tend to cluster in quadrant 4, having weaker beliefs in climate science and a stronger preference to leave, or to stay, sorry. So I plotted the same x-axis against worldviews, and the takeaway here is that people with more community and egalitarian worldviews tend to have preferences to see resources devoted towards long-term actions to relocate from the islands, versus those who are more individualistic and hierarchical in their views. So I also identified a lot of conflicts, values conflicts in my work, in my in-depth transcript analysis of over 32 transcripts. And some of the emerging conflicts were conflicts over risk perceptions and time horizons for action. So at the municipal level, for example, we saw the municipal officials having a great faith in the dune system and saying, we have so much sand coming in, it's gonna hold up to the future storms. But then the residents who actually lived on the island were really struggling to have faith in that system, saying we're struggling with constant erosion. So they're seeing more urgency for planning. There's also conflicting financial incentives at the municipal level. We see that the municipality did not want to see buyouts happening in places like Ortley Beach because it would affect their tax base. And this really rolls into these conflicts about distributing costs and responsibilities, or basically who pays. Is it the households that absorb the shock, local government, or the federal and state government? And I think that this conflict is really keeping us trapped in this repetitive loss cycle where we're building, experiencing damages, and rebuilding again. So I have a lot of thoughts on future research. I'm gonna have to go through this pretty quickly here, but based on my deductive analysis of my transcripts, this is my perception of the development cycle in a place like Ortley Beach, these barrier islands. So you have this pre-storm development, you have a disaster event, you have damages to the housing stock, it impacts the municipal tax base. Some of the lower income residents may be displaced. And then we have this critical decision-making point, do we stay or do we leave? But what happens, you have this influx of federal and state funds, the supporting infrastructure goes back in, the protective infrastructure goes back in, there's insurance and housing assistance, and the development pressure comes back in, and you see investors purchasing small homes at sale price and investing in these large high rises that can comply with building codes. So a question though is, are these buildings able to withstand future shocks and damages? And what are the kind of, what are the secondary effects? Are more people being displaced? So there's a lot more areas to continue trying to understand like the magnitude of people who are displaced, the magnitude of the influx of different types of funds and investment pressure, and who's making these critical decisions about fair. Okay, so final chapter, chapter 3, this is my trade-offs chapter. This is kind of my ongoing research area. So we're looking at, the question is, how can the trade-offs of elevations and buyouts be better characterized to help prioritize federal investments? And I took all this information from the national study, and I took all this information from the interviews, and I designed 5 different scenarios. The first is a counterfactual. It says, let's pretend nothing happened. There was no Sandy. There was no home elevations, no home improvements. Everything's kind of on that first story level. And then let's take this scenario 1 that says, no, Sandy happened. Let's reconstruct history and try to replicate reality where all of these homes were rebuilt and elevated. And then scenario 2 is this another counterfactual that says, instead of rebuilding everything, let's buy everything out. And then I have 2 clustered buyout scenarios, one on the Atlantic side and one on the lower lying Bay side. So I have 2 parts to my trade-off analysis methodology. The first was looking at how costs accrued, like actually looking at the historical record and trying to rebuild what actually happened and see how, what was the financial impact to the federal government, the municipal government, and households. So jumping into the results from part 1, where we mapped out the stakeholders here, and these are discounted cumulative flows between 2012 and 2022 in 2020 US dollars. And what we're seeing is a huge amount of funding flowing towards the municipality in ways that benefit the municipality, repairing roads, helping with debris removal, beach nourishment, and in return, not a lot of cost share forked over from the municipal side. So for about every dollar that went in from the municipality to rebuild Ortley Beach, I estimate that the federal government spent about $10 in return. And similarly, on the household side, households had to pay premiums, but for every dollar that they spent, there was about $9 coming out from the federal government. However, we have to recognize that these flows don't cover all of the household costs. So there were out-of-pocket expenses from households, which led to the displacement of some households. And for me, this is an area that definitely needs more research to understand the full range and uncertainty around these average costs, but these are my best estimates from the data that I have. So now moving on to part 2 of the trade-off methodology, we're expanding this analysis now. We're going from this 10-year period where we have historical data, we're projecting it another 40 years into the future for a total time band of 50 years. And we're doing a societal economic analysis where we're taking the aggregate cost to society and trying to find a scenario that helps them to minimize those costs. So it becomes an optimization question where you're trying to minimize both the upfront policy costs as well as any costs associated with residual risk. So for those scenarios where there's still buildings on the islands, what is that residual risk and how can we minimize it? And also protection costs like beach nourishment. So I think just arguably, this is a really rough trade-off analysis as it stands. I see this as an area of ongoing research and future collaboration. And this is my results to date. So what you can see right off the bat is that if you do nothing, if you don't elevate any of the homes, for example, you have a huge amount of residual risk because those homes are more vulnerable to storm surge. But if you make a small investment, upfront policy costs of elevating those homes, then you can help bring that residual risk down. So in the analysis so far, elevations appear to be the least costly solution with the minimal inputs that I have included. And buyouts are prohibitively or seem prohibitively expensive. It's almost $1 billion to buy out all of these homes. But a key takeaway for me is that we need better estimates of these residual risks associated with being on the island and these protection costs. So I have very conservative estimates of protection costs associated with beach nourishment. And there's reason to believe that that beach nourishment may be more costly. So regarding residual risk, I'm using estimates from a third party called First Street Foundation, which provides property level estimates of damages out into the future. So these are estimated losses in 2051, taking into account different probabilistic storm events. And we see that the projected losses are over on the lower Line Bay side, which makes sense. And if we think about it from a flood depth perspective, but my concern is that this model may be taking into account the dune system as a protective measure, but not its probability of failure. And if we look at the before and after images of Ortley Beach, the Bayside definitely suffered a huge amount of flooding. We see debris flows here, but actual destruction and damages occurred on the Atlantic side where you had that shock and that storm surge. So I think that perhaps in these low probability events, there's a potential for high losses. So to improve this in the future, I think there's ways to improve that. We could do this by improving both property level risk assessments, where you take into account better estimates of first floor elevation, projected probabilities of total water levels, and you come up with a depth damage function and estimate future damages and get a better net present value of residual risk. So lots of work collaboratively to do there. And then at the community level, there's opportunities to improve community level risk assessments by better estimating the cost of beach nourishment, how that might change over the future. What are the costs of infrastructure maintenance and residual risk to infrastructure? What are costs associated with emergency response and evacuation? What are benefits associated with clustered buyouts and nature-based solutions? And how is this all affected by changing population dynamics and property markets within the political economic context governed by changing rules and regulations and changing politics? So this is an area that I'm really curious to keep digging in. So just wrapping up now, my key takeaways are that in the United States and through the lens of the studies that I've conducted, I think that there is evidence from a cultural theory perspective that there is a cultural and political economy of rebuilding in areas that experience repetitive losses. There are institutional and governance barriers to transformative solutions like managed relocation, and we really see that coming through with municipal revenues being very attached to property taxes. So it creates these barriers to wanting to see people relocate. And ultimately, current benefit cost analyses are structured in a way that tilt resources towards rebuilding rather than relocating. So I think there's a lot of work to do to incrementally tweak how we do benefit cost analysis and also to move beyond just a cost-benefit analysis paradigm and regulatory review and consider a host of other considerations. And so ultimately, I think it's paramount that we try to break this build, damage, rebuild cycle so we don't have situations like this with homes falling into the ocean in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. I think increasingly all around the world, we're seeing more and more homes and buildings just falling into the ocean. And this just isn't good for current and future generations. So some policy recommendations just to close out. I think one is just to follow the money. There's a huge amount of federal funding coming down the pipeline. So we can increase tracking, transparency, and accountability in federal spending, and really try to highlight where we're seeing spending in areas that experience repetitive losses. Two is to incentivize relocation at scale. So that means incrementally tweaking our regulatory analysis to better reflect the cost of staying and the benefits of relocation and how these are distributed through society. And then finally, I think that more resources, a lot of money is going towards infrastructure, but this is really a social process. So I think more resources could go towards neighborhood action planning, where you're proactively engaging with communities to try to identify socially acceptable thresholds for community-led relocation. And, elevations may be a good short-term solution, and it may help a community up to a certain point, but when do we need to start thinking about and planning for possible relocation? So with that, just thanks to everybody. I think I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can open up the floor. And thank you all for coming. Thanks.
Good. So let's take questions from non-committee members first.
So open to the public. If you all have any comments or questions, I welcome. I don't see anything in. Okay, Irina, thank you. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
I had a small question. I don't know that much about the urban policy. I know that in the health policy, what very often happens is that if once a county decides to pursue certain type of policy, then like a neighboring county, is more likely to do it, etc. They call it policy diffusion. Now you're looking, I think, at a more granular policy than the counties because you're more looking like the zip codes, the towns. But do you think you observe something like this going on too? Like if one area is more likely to do the buyouts, then the other area next to it is more likely to do that.
Yes, Irina, I do think that there may be some neighborhood effect. And actually this is something that I think would be an interesting extension of my analysis, is that perhaps there is kind of some spatial correlation. Well, we can kind of see that through the map. So possibly an extension of the national study would to incorporate a spatial lag or spatial error and start to get into a spatial regression model analysis. And that would be an interesting kind of comparison methodology. Mm-hmm. So I do think I could learn from the health literature and see what kind of methodologies have been applied there to see if there is this kind of neighboring and spatial effect, just because we do see some clustering of elevations in certain areas. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, the next I see is Lauren Nolan and then Katie Can. So if Lauren's not there, I'll ask Katie.
Hi, Laura. Congratulations on an excellent presentation. It was so great to hear about your whole project. I was curious to hear a little bit more about, you mentioned the HUD program and specifically that was talking about having that lower and median income criteria that they kind of didn't need to apply. I don't know if it was because of Sandy, I missed that. But I'm just curious if you were thinking about any other type of like guardrails that would be applicable for some of these policies to be more equitable in the future. If you think Justice 40 maybe is like a way that this is going to move or change some of these programs, or if that's insufficient from your perspective.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. Justice 40, so just for the general audience, Justice 40 is an executive order passed under the Biden administration that states that at least 40% of federal funding should benefit lower and moderate income populations, as I understand it. And one of my policy recommendations is actually to expedite the integration of Justice 40 into kind of legacy programs like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which still is not implementing Justice 40. We are seeing Justice 40 being piloted through the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. And I think that there is a lot of really interesting kind of experimental work going on within BRIC, that last program I mentioned, to try to orient those resources. But moving back to the HUD issue that you signaled, I was very, very interested to find kind of like so much money flowing to Toms River through unmet needs. And I did a lot of research to try to understand what this unmet needs is. And the best I could understand is that it's kind of a workaround for not having to meet that low and moderate income criteria. And the question is, why? Why in Toms River are they benefiting so much? What is the process there? So I think that opens up another can of worms. There's also that Toms River, I didn't get to show you that well, but there's also a big chunk of change coming down HUD for assistance to local government services, unmet needs as well, like a bunch of money. And it's like, why is that money not distributed more widely among low and moderate income municipalities? So I think that there maybe, there could be political connections that are kind of, you talk about this in the theory about Lipsky mentions street level bureaucracy. So at the smaller local levels, how does national policy maybe become distorted in its local implementation? And perhaps that is showing up in the numbers. Thanks, Katie.
Laura, and congrats.
Thank you. Lauren, are you able to?
I'm back. I am so sorry for my technical difficulties, but we are good now. Laura, congratulations. It's been so exciting to see this research evolve as a fellow cohort member. My question is, your models were fantastic, looking at the cost trade-offs between elevation versus buyouts, right? And I also really appreciated how in your takeaways you acknowledged that there's a social element to this, there's a political element to this, right? And there's, we need to think more about how we calculate and assess risk, but you're acknowledging those other additional complexities. And so my question is, in thinking about, the Jersey Shore hurricane, Sandy context, and perhaps comparing it to the Midwestern floods in the 90s, like you mentioned, or Hurricane Katrina, how should we be, and how perhaps could our models be, and how should we socially and politically be thinking about the costs and counting for the costs and trade-offs of rebuilding or elevating or relocating a vacation community versus a community that is maybe full-time? And I'm thinking about the differences up and down the Jersey Shore in terms of who's a vacationer versus this is their home, their livelihood, right? Their only location. So thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, that's actually another reason that Ortley Beach was such a fascinating community for me to study from an equity perspective, because a lot of times equity research you focus on your low and moderate income communities. But I think that we need to see the flip side of the coin. Where is the money going and who's it accumulating to? And in the case of Hurricane Sandy, there's a report that states that even though from a statutorial perspective, FEMA funds are not supposed to be oriented towards secondary homes. I think the statistic, it blew my mind. I think it was like over 60 or 70% of funds were actually going towards secondary homes. So there's a lot of loopholes going on. I think it might have to do with when you have that shock event, and then who has the time and the political power and connections to actually navigate the formal aid network and get to those resources. And the loudest bird gets the worm, right? So if you're making a lot of noise, maybe you're able to access those resources. So I'm trying to look at the equity kind of from the flip side. What's also interesting though, is that in a place like Ortley Beach, there were cohorts, like the first people that moved there, I don't think, that was sometimes their secondary home, but for a lot of people, it became their primary home over time. And from my conversations, like it's a really complicated community. Yes, it's majority white and wealthy, It's majority white, but there's a lot of mixed income. So there's a lot of fixed income retiree households. And some were saying, if this happens again, we're not going to survive the shock. Also, our community is transforming around us. All these multi-million-dollar homes are going up. We can't keep up with the taxes. We're kind of like stuck in this place. So that was why I tried to show that development slide, where it kind of tries to show the process and mechanics of coastal climate gentrification, which even the same residents were saying, we're experiencing this under our feet. Our community is almost like migrating away from us. So lots of really interesting dynamics to dig into around who's benefiting. Is it people with secondary homes, or is it the primary homeowners that really may be needing this, and renters, which I haven't even dug into in my own research. That's a whole nother that's a whole nother area to look into. Thank you, Lauren. I'm gonna just quickly look through the chat to try to see some questions. So from Cassie, thanks for a wonderful presentation. It was fascinating. I wonder if for your national model, were there any variables that you wanted to include that you were unable due to lack of data? So yes, there are a lot of areas that I think I could dig into. And there is a possibility that there could be some omitted variable bias that could inflate some of the other coefficients. But I think, for example, there may be more work to do to dig into insurance data. So what is the policy coverage? How does that relate to where elevations and buyouts are happening? I want to get at better estimates of political data. So political data was really difficult. I could only get it at the county level. So there's vast ways to improve the variables that are included. When was the median home? When was the home built? What was the, how old are these structures? Is that having a play into like whether we tear it down or build it back up? So I think that this is a real exploratory phase, but kind of bringing a new comparison to the field, and lots more to dig into. So yeah, thank you for that great question. What would help would be if I could get at property level data, because right now, since things are aggregated at the zip code area, it's very difficult to get at some of the drivers that may be happening at finer scales of geography as well. So for example, how close are you really to the coastal zone? Okay, so Lisa says, I don't recall seeing it as one of your hypotheses around elevations versus buyout ratios, but for the elevation being more clustered around the areas of the coast, did you look at how sea level rise amounts in those regions may have been a factor? Thinking you could look at changes in nuisance flooding over time as an indicator of sea level rise in a location. Lisa, if I understand your question correctly, and feel free to type in, okay, yeah, so is nuisance flooding a driver of elevations versus buyouts? I think that's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that question, and it would be very interesting to see if there was a measure or time series of when we're seeing nuisance flooding occur, and try to, if it's by year event, to try to like match it into the data to run that kind of analysis. Again, that'd probably require a whole nother cleaning of a new data set, but if you know of anything, I'd be happy to incorporate it. Okay, I have another question. Lisa, did I answer your question? Okay, I'm gonna take it as a yes. Great presentation, Laura. How representative do you feel the interviews at Ortley Beach were with regard to other communities? Great question. I think that's Joe. Okay, yes, it's a very small sample size. So with regards to Ortley Beach itself, I think that there is it's hard to say, is it fully representative of the community? I'm sure it's not. I'm sure there's other population types, maybe younger households, but given the demographic, which is largely elderly and mixed income, I think I capture a segment of the population. Also, a lot of the people who participated were community leaders. So in a way, they have a grasp of what is a sentiment of other households on the islands. what would be really cool, and what is actually going on at Blasting now, is trying to capture public sentiment across New Jersey with a wider sample. So, for example, one of my colleagues, Garen Bolger, who is a PhD student as well, is leading a Eagleton opinion poll survey where, we would survey over 1,000 people from across New Jersey to try to get at maybe a more representative sample, both in coastal areas and outside. But with regards to Ortley Beach, I do think that if you look at the demographic up and down some of these barrier island communities, there are a lot of areas that have similar characteristics, being older populations, retiree income, and mixed income, with a lot of secondary households. I have a question from Elisa. Are these raised houses constructed to withstand increasingly powerful and frequent hurricanes? If I remember correctly, Hurricane Sandy was a Category 2 storm. Is your model designed for specific events, such as Hurricane Sandy, or can it be applied to different hurricane categories? So with regard to the model you're asking about, is it the model for the national study? I'm going to just interpret the question. So, okay, the one from the New Jersey coastline. Okay, so I don't know if these homes are actually built to, there's all this FEMA guidance, there's all this engineering guidance. These homes are supposed to be built to standards. I'm not an engineer, and I don't have the specialized knowledge to tell you what is that tipping point where they won't withstand a certain shock. So, and actually that's kind of the crux of the question is, will the building standards be enough? Is this regulatory incentive enough to mitigate risk, and for how long into the future, and under what kinds of conditions in the future? So in the case of Hurricane Sandy, even it doesn't matter how much concrete you pour into the ground or how much steel you put into the ground, if the ground itself starts moving, if the ocean picks up the whole beach and plows it through a community, I think there's a limit to what the structural engineering can do. Now, what is that limit? I don't know, but I think it's a fascinating research gap as to what is the capacity of elevations to withstand shocks. What is the life cycle of an elevation? And when, you might be in an elevated building, but then other hazards may become a problem as well. For example, you may have sunny day flooding, you may not be able to get to your house. In my interviews with people, I also heard people mention fear about wind events. So there's updraft under those buildings. They're sensing the building shaking in wind events. So are they more vulnerable to other hazards? I think these are unknowns we haven't figured out. So with regards to the final model, if that's the one you're talking about with the societal trade-off analysis, when we look at the residual risk estimates, if that's your question, then the residual risk estimates take into 6 different return period or different probability of events. So it does take into account different categories of storms. But again, I think there's room to improve on those risk estimate models.
Can I chime in on the meteorology?
Yeah, so this is Bob Cobb.
Yeah, so Sandy was actually a post-tropical storm when it hit, so they undergone a transition when it hit New Jersey. Its wind speeds were comparable to Category 1, but all the damage here is surge driven. And all of this elevation stuff is focused on surge. So it's, so Laura mentioned the concern about people in some of the houses is, am I making my house more vulnerable to wind through elevation? And I don't know where the engineering thresholds are on that. But this is all driven by surge damage from a post-tropical storm, not hurricane wind damage.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Gracias. All right, if there's any last burning question, I'm happy to take it. Otherwise, I'll probably sign out and get grilled by my committee. Thank you all so much for joining. Appreciate it.